I read one sentence in your book and in your essay about Jia, where you describe his relationship with reality as intelligent because he does not try to impose a pre-established moral vision onto it. And he lets reality speak to the film. I was thinking that you were using perhaps that kind of method in terms of editing this film because you're trying to anchor his film in reality by showing a scene, then showing where it was shot, constantly bringing it back to the real, and if the real is not there anymore, then you trace back the history behind it. I just wanted to launch this idea.
I'm going to try to reply to the several questions in the question by starting referring to the very first time I personally met Jia and talked with him, which was at the Mostra de São Paulo in 2007. And I asked him, who are the filmmakers who brought you to cinema? And he said, well, Antonioni taught me what space was, Bresson what time was, and Hu Shaoxian the importance of everyday's life in how you can relate that to to the film. And in selecting the shots, but also in conceptualizing the documentary, I had that in mind as well, and thought at the beginning to work with the different layers of memory. First, knowing that his own memories had somehow allowed films like Platform to exist or Cherbourg to exist, to go back to the people who were part of that. That is his sister, who is at the basis of Platform, but all his friends that he kept up to this day, and celebrate him every time he goes to Fenyang. And blend that with the idea of a collective memory, which is the memory of a country in urgent transformation. And maybe there's no country whose identity has changed and altered so rapidly in the last 10 years than China. And Jia Zhangke was the filmmaker that managed somehow to relay that on film. And then, last but not least, try to bring out a third layer, which is the layer of filming itself, that is coming back to the places where he had filmed and see what kind of memories that would generate to a filmmaker for whom memory is so fundamental. And this is how the film is constructed, but this is also how we ended up picking up the elements of the films that permeate the documentary. And I'm aware that there are too many of them, completely aware, and I go to Jia Zhangke saying that at the end you have to allow for imprecisions and imperfections to be in the film. That is one of the imperfections of the documentary itself, because there are too many clips, but there are too many moments of Jia Zhangke's films that I also love, and it was very hard to get to actually let go of them. And there may be a reason for that, and if I mention a line by Borges, Jorge Luis Borges, the Argentinian writer, used to say that his interest in literature was to name what hadn't been named yet. And I find it very difficult to do today in cinema because of the multiplicity of images that bombard us all the time. Yet, when I see Jia's films, I have the impression that something has been named, you see. And so I try to actually grasp those moments where I had the impression that that something had been architectured and constructed, and yet I didn't know of it, and bring them into the film. Going back to the last part of your question, I'm absolutely in awe with the fact that he is able to rebound constantly. So you see, he's the fact that the very end that he asked, what if the characters of Platform come back today and see what has happened into the world, you know, the other film, how would they respond to that ample universe that they had dreamed of being locked, you know, and so he's constantly reconsidering and asking himself what the world could be, and that I find astonishing. Even when he's talking about his father, which there was no question asked, he graced that to us. He suddenly started to talk about his family past, and which I had no idea of, except that Platform was dedicated to his father. At the end, he says, maybe that's what a son and
the relationship with his...
Maybe that is. It's not that's what. Even the title of his new film is, which is in Cannes now, based on the Platform films. It's not mountains will depart, mountains may depart. So this capacity to always relativizar, how do you say that? To relativize things is something that one has to be in awe with. And I also think that this generates the fact that even when he's doing documentaries, he rebels against the documentary form, and he brings in, for instance, 24 Cities, fictional elements, which is very akin to Eduardo's...
playing in English, Jogo de Cena.
Jogo de Cena, Eduardo Coutinho's film. And again, when he does Still Life, which is anchored in a very realistic story, he integrates elements, surrealist elements. Yet that reality was already so surrealist that it allows for buildings to explode or to take flight. You see, there's an inner freedom in him that starts from a complete understanding of what that is about, and it's a very powerful construction that somehow engravida, how do you say that? Impregnates the film as a whole, you know, in such a way that I have the impression that one scene echoes in the next scene, and in the next scene, and in the next scene, and in the next scene, which makes it very hard to pick one. Because they are all interdependent, and that's the strength of his films. They are all there for a reason, you see.
But what I find also astonishing is the echo of these films with your films and attitude to reality, your posture towards reality. I can see that your choice, although it was hard, it had a point. You could have left out the whole story about the father, but you put it in a very prominent place in the film, a kind of climactic scene where he becomes fearful about it, and the camera carries on rolling, and you let it roll, and you didn't cut it in the final cut of the film. And we know the key role that the absent father has in your filmography as a whole, and the kind of centrality of father figures in your approach to storytelling. So could you elaborate a little bit about that?
Yes. I think that the absence of the father is how would I say, is a rooting, how do I say that in English? The absence of the father, constitutivo, how do you say constitutivo? Is constitutive of a national identity in Brazil. We were created or named or invaded, whatever the word you want to use, by a colonial power who went, named the film Brazil, took out whatever tree was called Brazil. So the father came and left. And it's amazing in documentaries. We were talking about Coutinho's last documentary. The number of people who come in and say, "I don't know my father. I've been raised by my mother." The absence of the father is the constant echo in the stories you hear or you read about in Brazil. I'm not sure that that is what made the link to Jia's talking about his own father, because I was actually pretty much in doubt if I was to leave it or not, because for going back to that one day we were starting to shoot and that came about. Mm-hmm. And I actually the silence is due to the fact that I decided not to continue to ask questions, you know, just mm-hmm. And we that day that was it, you know. Mm-hmm. that anything that would come after that would have been I would say would have somehow abused of that moment of sorts. I felt like, okay, this is it, and let's see afterwards what I will make of it. I was getting the translation done at the, how do you say that, the simultaneous translation, but at that time also the translator was so moved that he couldn't continue. So I just had a part of it. It's a little bit, the second moment where that occurred was in the coffee shop, because as we got there, that was our last day of shoot over there, and it was about celebrating his next shoot. And when we get there, that situation in front of us was everything but, of course, the possibility of doing a film. And his personal assistant hadn't arrived, so I didn't have the translation. Mm-hmm. And I stood there for a while, and we were a crew of 3, so we were very, very few people. And I actually, after 15 or 20 minutes, allowing them some time, I asked them whether that should be shot or not, understanding that something had occurred. Mm-hmm. And he says, "Yes, please shoot, because that's part of what we're doing."
That's when he learns that his film has been
Yes,
edited.
that occurred on that day,
yeah.
which was the last day we were shooting. And how many filmmakers would have asked us not to shoot during that day, you know? And that tells a lot about his own
bravery and commitment.
Well, no, his own commitment to something that is truly the reflection of what is bouncing at that very moment, you know, what he was feeling at that moment. And somehow it nourished the film as a whole, you know. I'm also very much an admiration of the fact that somebody who can tell us that, who blended, you know, elements of the classic and pop, and you know, who as we said, grammatically also blended very different narrative styles, is always there reconsidering what come last, what can come next, to the point where he, I like it when he says, when pop music came, it was not about the we anymore, it was about the I. Yet a little bit later he says, look at what happened with the I. Look at what happened with the market economy in this country, and the violence becoming a possible discourse as a result of that. So he's rebounding again and again and again, and it's quite unique to see a mind doing that, you know.
You just to pick up on that question of the we as opposed to I,
Yes.
if we could relate that to authorship and the fact that you say, I love all Jia's films, but I wouldn't say the same about many other filmmakers whose films I like, but not all of them. But I like all Jia's films. I was thinking about that, leading us towards that vision of the auteur that who is always behind the films, and you feel the person and the signature behind or inscribed on the images and sounds that we hear. And thinking about him, but also thinking about your work, whether you see that your kind of authorship shares the kind of authorial signature that you encounter in Jia's films.
I don't really think it does. Also because I think that Jia has a much more precise understanding, both in fiction and in documentary, of what interests him at that specific moment. And I think that he has, again, the ability to... The same man who's capable to say, well, the person who brought me to... The filmmakers who brought me to cinema are Antonioni, because he made me understand about time, and Bresson, about space, and Bresson, who made me understand about time. This is the guy who is able to do a film about the implosion of space and time, which is the world. You see, I don't think I would have that capacity to reach that kind of synthesis to start with. But more than that, is 2 years later, it's, you know, he rebounds on still life, which is something that I find extremely difficult to do as well. He takes an event that has been reproduced 150,000 times and manages to narrate or to create a new discourse based on something that has been, you know, like an orange that has been pressed too many times, and he's able to find something fresh and new, starting from the same, same press. I find that quite unique in cinema as a whole. I mean, I wouldn't be able to pinpoint another filmmaker who would probably be able to say, I truly admire all of his films. Jia, I truly love and admire his films, which is, you can admire a film without loving it, you know. I see many people agreeing with that.
I'll just ask one more question and then turn to the audience, because I'm sure they are dying to ask their own questions to you. I feel that constant self-deprecating attitude on your part that the English will recognize very well, because it's typical. But one thing that is totally astonishing is your name being kind of hidden and appearing just at the final credits as a director of this film. Other things that I find totally astonishing is that Xiao Wu, that you saw for the first time in English, I think there is a kind of translation to pickpocket.
I think it's pickpocket.
Yeah. Although Xiao Wu is a proper name, is the name of the character. You've seen this film during the 1998 Berlin Film Festival, when Central Station was being awarded the Golden Bear, and it was Fernanda Montenegro being awarded the Silver Bear for Best Actress. It was the consecration of the new Brazilian cinema. It was something that would entitle you entirely to be completely self-centered and forgetting about everything else. And yet you were searching for new ideas and looking for the film by somebody else and becoming so enthralled by it that you decided, I want to work about this guy. So I just find that admirable.
The first thing I would say is that, you know, maybe if Jia allows me to say that, you know, when my own father, just before my own father passed away, I saw that he started to lose interest in reading, for instance, or watching films or talking about things. I said, something is going to happen. I think that once you lose interest in the world surrounding you, it's really not a very good sign. I've always had more kind of a plaisir cinéphile, how do you say that, cinephilic pleasure, almost than doing the films itself, you know. We're talking about Ceylan, who's Ceylan?
Ceylan, I think.
Ceylan. As being a filmmaker, we both admire. I love, for instance, a film of his called Uzak, which is, I think it's called Distant here. And Once Upon a Time in Anatolia. And also, a little bit like Jia Zhangke, I think he's one of those filmmakers that speak about our time, perhaps in his case less directly than Jia, or maybe his characters. The characters in Jia Zhangke's films somehow mirror the crisis of the Chinese society as a whole. You can find the direct relation, which is a little bit more discreet, I would say, or indirect in Ceylan's film. But if that happens, it's probably because that Turkish society with its layers is not as immediately decodable for us. China, for us Brazilians, has many ways in, including the violence, the social violence that abounds now. This is something that we can easily relate to. But cinema, I think, is still, on a personal basis, as you're asking the question personally, something that still astonishes me. You know, we're talking about nostalgia de la luz. I think the sense of wonder, it's very hard to have the sense of wonder, and cinema, I think, still brings it. This is what allows me to have somehow believe that there is a role for cinema before anything else. It's the possibility of wonder, which I don't get in the iPhone watching 2001 State Odyssey. You know? It's that, eventually, that possibility. By the way, can I show those images?
Yes.
Two images. I brought two images to from the square. They were taken. Those two images were taken 8 years apart. So this, all these people are waiting for one event, and it's the announcement of the new pope. And that was, if I'm not mistaken, 2004, 2005. Okay, it's interesting because you see, everybody's concentrated on the announcement itself, and you actually see three telephones in the image. There's this one very clearly visible. Then on this man's face, you have the reflection of a telephone there, and there's a third one over there. Okay, now I would like to go to the second image, which has been taken 8 years later. And they're waiting for the announcement to occur, or the new pope. So the announcement hasn't come yet. Inventors did Tokyo Guy, that film on Ozu, and at the beginning he's on an airplane, and there's a film going on, and he says, "I'm not going to watch the film because I will never remember it." And so I wonder if anyone will ever remember this, you know.
What happened there?
So what happened there? So in a world where there's been such a horizontalization of images, it's very rare to, it's very difficult, I think, to be able to do a cinematic statement such as Nostalgia de la Luz or say Still Life or a Platform or you know, the Ceylon films. It is hard yet necessary. I find cinema today to be more necessary than it was before. Although the unity of time has changed completely, although as a writer once told me, there's no more away. The away has disappeared. But when I see a film by Jia Zhangke, I have the impression that no, it hasn't completely disappeared. It has been banalized, but it hasn't disappeared. It's very different. These are two different things altogether, you know. Meaning that there is a possibility to still unveil the world through cinema, which is what brought me to cinema to start with, when I hit the croissant in France. You know, it was about realizing that there were worlds I was completely unaware of. But I'm not talking about only the physical geography, the human geography as well, and people who lived, you know, so differently than I lived, and that was so enriching in so many ways. Jia Zhangke is one of the few filmmakers who still allowed this to happen, but it doesn't mean that 10 other filmmakers would not be able to do this, you know, and you don't need to be geographically where he is. I think that what makes him so unique is the capacity to conceive. I find it much more difficult to conceive of a film today than it was before. For every 2 or 3 screenplays I've worked on in the last years, I normally let 2 go rapidly because the reality just takes over, and what I have been developing up to that moment lost. You know, I suddenly realized that it lost its capacity of true reflection. Of you know, it's dwarfed by reality. So you somehow have to be way in advance to be able to again be in synchronicity. It's becoming more difficult to do that, and thus my admiration for those who do this has only grown, in the past years.
I think the public has the right to.
I love the idea of the public.
Interrogate you, Yoram. Yeah.
Just a couple of comments, a couple of things just mentioned now. I was reading very recently about this phenomenon of the electronic device and recording of the event, that more than only that activity of trying to record the event being an obstruction to recall in any sense of memory, is that it's such an obstruction that there's no memory that can form in the first place. So that one can record the event in some way, but it has very little or nothing to do with one's own reflection upon, as a device for memory, because of that device, there's no memory being formed in the first place. And so, widely speaking, there's a collective amnesia because the memories are not being formed in the first place. And just relating that to Christian Keithley writes in Cinephilia and History about the experience of watching films being embedded within the memory of the experience and the setting and the ritualization of the dark room and everything, and how that's so central to the engagement with film is the context of viewership, where the memory of the experience of watching that film is more than just the recollection of the film. So it's the recollection of the experience of engaging with the film. And finally, I remember watching a Jia Zhangke film in Carlo Vivari a few years ago, and feeling that the experience of being with him in an auteur sense, that he had allowed me to enter into his sensibility, was so different to the rest of the sort of circus of a very good, the wonderful film festival, which is a pleasure to be at a film festival to watch. But the experience of watching Jia's film in that setting introduced such a direct engagement with reality that made everything else feel much less real. So just a collection of random thoughts about engaging with those films. So a lot of
I agree with them completely.
I think this is a comment. Any more questions?
We were wondering here about the role of Frodon.
Frodon. Frodon is one of the very early defensores, how do you say that? Defenders of Jia's films in France, first in Le Monde, then as an editor of the Cahiers du Cinéma. And the original idea, was to do a book and then a documentary where Léon Cacor from Marché de São Paulo and I would gather around the project, and then we soon realized that we had to bring in somebody that Léon wouldn't be able to do the journey, and we both thought of Jean-Michel as a unique traveling companion because of his understanding not only of Jia's importance, but also of Chinese cinematography, and how also he, Jia Zhangke redefined it and collided against, for instance, the fifth generation, the Xi'an generation that preceded it. So the project wouldn't exist without Jean-Michel. He was extremely important in defining it and organized the book that we ended up doing with Cosaque Naïf and the Master. It was really quite a gift to have him on board.
Was him at the shooting situation?
He was at part of the shoot, yes. He arrived at the last day of Fenyang, but then he stayed with us during that train journey. The interview in the train was done by Jean-Michel, and then in the world, and also, as you can see, he's part of that seminar, that masterclass that Jia does at the CAFA, the school. There's a story about that actually. That's three days before it happened. He said, I was meant to give a masterclass at CAFA, but we never truly scheduled it. And I said, well, it would be great if you schedule it, but we have to leave in 7 days. I said, no, we'll schedule it in 3 days. So that was as we were heading to Beijing. When we arrived in Beijing, the poster was made, and
it was that crowd.
And that crowd, and 3,000 people are waiting outside.
Incredible.
I said, if that is independent cinema in China, I would love this to be reproduced in Brazil. He also has a Twitter. What he calls Weibo is a form of Twitter in which Jia Zhangke interferes in Chinese culture or socio-political scene, and he posts something there every 2 or 3 days.
And
there's a comment.
His followers.
And I said, how interesting that you have the time to do this, because he also produces first-time directors and runs the companies. It's incredible that you're able to do that work. And how many followers you have? Not many yet. I said, well, how many? 15 million. So again, that's independent cinema in China. You know, this is how it...
Yes, please.
So I would like to ask you, you mentioned that there was a translator
Yes.
while you were making the film. I wanted to know how it's like to travel through language and make a film in a different language in a context that you might not be so familiar with, or to
Well,
what
first thing,
extent?
it was very interesting to go to Fenyang and understand that I wasn't the only one in that situation, because in most of his films, what you have is the Shanxi, which is the region dialect. So the sound engineer was from Beijing and actually spoke French, so we were speaking in French, and I asked him, listen, how much of the dialect are you getting? And he said, as much as you are. and which also untapped something that I hadn't understood at that point, is that Jia Zhangke is a filmmaker in between cultures, at the margin of a culture, which allows him to see it from inside and from the outside at the very same time. Second fact is that his films have to be subtitled in Mandarin if they're watched by most of the population, or even in other dialects, as there are 160 different dialects in China. So you are confronted to a reality that he is confronting constantly as a film director. As I was fed by the immediate translation that allowed for a constant conversation, and when Frodon came in, he had the exact same thing, which makes the exchange very fluid and allows you to actually be able to almost forget that it exists. And also we're talking with film students today that something came to my mind, is that you're really truly doing cinema when you forget that you're doing cinema. That you're forgetting that the camera is there, that you're forgetting the number of elements, that it's just life burgeoning in there that you're able to capture. And at a certain moment you forget that the translation is there, as you're forgetting any other sounds that may be rebounding, the echo of something. You're so concentrated on what somebody is doing or telling that it ceases to be, what is happening outside ceases to be important. So rapidly you forget about the translation. I have to say that if this happened, it's because also Jia Zhangke truly is that person that you see there all the time. There's no veil, there's no construction of the filmmaker's persona. It's just him, you see. That makes it so much, so enjoyable, truly, because afterwards there's no need to deconstruct anything or to unveil anything. It's you're always working in the direct form, and it just becomes pretty interesting. At the same time, there's a prudeness. There's you sense the distance that is a perfect distance that he somehow establishes. It's not only the lens that establishes it; it's himself and how he places himself in the frame. It's very. Frankly, the name it's to be co-directed by Jia Zhangke.
But let me play the devil's advocate.
Please
just for a minute, so that he's not just a god. Perhaps he has some failures here and there. Although it's just a joke. But I was just thinking that it's a very male world. The one that he's portraying there, and his close companions. Obviously, there is Jiao Tao, who is also his muse and companion.
yes.
But we never see the two together. They are interviewed separately. One thing I noticed when he meets his mother and she comes with the tea, the first thing he does is to complain about the tea. It's not brewed enough. Before anything else, you know.
You're very sensitive to tea living in England.
So although he was so dramatic about his father's story, he seems to be quite matter of fact.
I'll transmit. I'll transmit.
I just wonder what your view is about that. And the thing about drinking, obviously, is entirely male. It's not something that the women do in China, not in the same context. Bottoms up all the time. And, yeah.
It's true, although Zhao Tao doesn't refuse the
does she do
Fenyang
it?
wine, yes, I have to say.
Yeah.
I think you would probably say the same thing of most of the Cinema Novo experience, or you know, it's or even we're mentioning Ceylon. I think that you would probably say that in many cultures, because that fight has become a universal one as well. And that fight for uma igualdade de gênero, how do you say that? You know,
gender equality.
Gender equality. It has been. It's not.
Well, so I love the moment it cuts.
She does as well, and I think you would love it as also because it blends high culture and low culture. Because you talk about impure cinema, and that is a direct translation of that. Because in the same film, you have the reference to 19th or 18th century opera at one hand, and then the wuxia, which is the most popular warriors film, martial arts film, blended into one, which is also, I think, an extraordinary strength of Jia Zhangke. How you can blend what is called high culture and low culture. I don't like this kind of definition, but let's say just for the sake of the discussion, that is a very hard thing to do.
Timothy?
Yeah, first of all, thanks. Great film. Loved it. And I love the clips that you showed from this film. I thought they were fantastic. You know, I have a whole lineup of ones that I really like. But one of them I thought was really powerful in an odd way, and I wonder if you could comment on it. It's the one with I can't remember which film it's from, where the kid's on the motorcycle, and he's going up the hill, and it keeps stalling out on him. And he just holds the shot again and again.
Yeah, unknown pleasure.
And as you were talking about, you know, this, you know, the heritage of Bresson, the kind of openness of all of his films, this question of naming. I just wonder if you could comment on this.
That one blends Bresson and Antonioni in the same one, isn't it? Because it stretches time, and at the same time it inserts the character in this very specific geography that now you have the time to completely apprehend. And what is interesting about that shot is that he says it contains very personal emotions, but I would say that it contains also a very personal understanding of cinema beyond what the visible is.
Exactly,
And if we accept, for instance, Kieslowski's definition that cinema is about the invisible that complements the visible, then there is something there to continuously watch you discover things on the image that do not appear immediately, including in the sound. I don't know if you remember that after stalling, I don't know how many times, the motorcycle stops very near camera, and then the guy takes off the engine. He puts it off. Is that correct in English? Puts it off, and you can see that the engine truly halts because the motorcycle does this. Yet the sound continues. Yeah. The sound is not realistic at all. it just continues to come and impregnates the scene until the very end, which I find completely extraordinary. I realized that after the 7th or 8th time I saw the film.
I thought that was a fault in the motorbike.
No, it's not. The motorbike really stalls, and he opted for the sound to continue. It's as if
it's unscripted, correct?
it's unscripted.
Yeah.
It's as if giving life to the tiger. You know, suddenly in a realistic film,
right, yeah.
the camera pans to the tiger, and then you have that.
Yeah.
I think it's a obviously non-realistic approach to a realistic scene, and that again is his strength. It's the inner freedom of the cinematic construction is to be truly pinpointed, because it's quite unusual, you know, and you see that working all the time.
And it did, I did feel like it crystallized a lot of the things you were saying about his larger perspective too. That one little shot.
Yeah, I also love the previous one where he says, "When everything goes well,
Yeah.
I'm very unsatisfied," which I think is going to help me a lot when everything is going to go very badly, you know, which it normally does, and you say, "Oh, okay, how great it is."
But that thing brings me back to the question of performance, mixed with capturing the real as it happens. And if we could go back to that case of 24th City,
Right.
and playing,
Right.
which is the Brazilian film Jogo de Cena, and how, without knowing each other, probably, I don't think that Coutinho ever
They
was
were shot at the same time.
yeah, so
Those two
it's
films
just
were
a
shot at the
coincidence.
same time, and in both films you have, you know, people being interviewed who truly were part of that scene, and then actors coming in and playing
the same part.
in Coutinho's
Is the
world
same.
the exact same part, they're just repeating it, and in his world in 24 City, actors come in, and they are known actors in China, so they are truly fictionalizing depoimentos. How do you say that? Statements that had been truly made by those people who passed away. And you see this. What matters there is not truth anymore. It's the truth of representation. Truly, it's about redefining what the truth of representation is. You know, and it was also mentioning earlier on that Godard, who has a good sentence for almost everything in cinema, he says that the good fiction films drift for him towards documentaries, and good documentaries drift towards fiction films. And in both Coutinho and Jia Zhangke, you and especially in those two examples that you mentioned, you can truly sense that. The intertwining of those two different narrative forms, you know, that are as old almost as cinema. Because if you go back to Men of Iron, the discussion was already a very heated one.
Yes.
You know.
Any more questions? Yes, please.
You said before how cinema has been a liberating experience for you. How would you?
It was many years ago. I'm just kidding.
Yeah, well, for the documentary. How would you compare this liberating process between being just an observer of a film and being a crafter, like someone who actually makes a film?
And No, it's an interesting question because I don't think that the perspective can actually be the same if you're doing a documentary or if you're doing a fiction film. I am totally against having sedimentada, how do you say that, a sedimented structure or architecture before you start doing your documentary, but completely for the perception that without a central idea that can rebound constantly in what you were doing, in what you were going to do, it would be an erratic exercise to do that documentary. So this is what we were talking about, the different layers of memory that interested me to start with before doing the film. In fiction, what I try to do is start with something way more rigorous structurally so that I can truly betray the structure later. In the sense that it has a little bit, it's a little bit like jazz. If you know the core, or the melody. To talk about melody and jazz doesn't make much sense, but if you know the central route, it's easier to bifurcate from it because you can find it again a little bit later. So, for instance, in Motorcycle Diaries, we have, in Cusco and Machu Picchu, we have 12 minutes of improvisation, but that it was only possible to improvise because the actors had worked so much on the characters that they were able to improvise in the logic of the characters. You see, so that is the difference, and if those rules are set, then it can be a liberating experience to work within them. It's as if you need the limit in order to find the liberation within it. You know, if you know the screenplay truly well, that is the limit, and if you have developed it well enough, you can always drift away from it and try different things in different takes because you know already what you have.
Thank you.
In connection with that, I notice also that you love to work in a team. You've collaborated with a number of people, here again with Jean-Michel Frodon, but also other people. You collaborated many times with Daniela Thomas as a co-director, co-script writer. I think that there are 3 or 4 script writers in Central Station. So you tend to attract people to come and work with you. So,
well, first I like the collectiveness of it, and I also like the fact that if we know each other a little bit better, it's easier to continue, in trying to find new paths to actually look at it with the same, people who have somehow helped you to construct, what you have done before. There's a truly interesting interview done by a French journalist called Rui Nogueira with Jean-Pierre Melville, who did The Samurai and many other films and who influenced the Nouvelle Vague. He's also a character in Godard's À bout de souffle. He plays the philosophy professor. And Rui Nogueira asks him at the beginning of the book, he said, if you were to tell me what is the most important element of a film, what would you say in construction of film? But say in percentage, in percentiles or in percentage?
Percentage.
In percentage. And he said, interesting question. And he said, well, I would say that 50% is the choice of the story that you want to bring to the screen. 50% is how you're going to translate it to the screen. 50% is the choice of the actors that you're going to find to actually convey what the characters want to say in there. 50% how you're going to light it, 50% the editing, 50% da-da-da. And if you got one of these elements right, you just screwed 50% of your film. So truly, it's the vector of development. You know, finding a vector of development that you're collectively conscient of really allows an idea to actually to grow and especially offers alternatives when you don't know how to proceed, and many times you don't know how to proceed. You're constantly confronting walls, you know, and the one way to solve them is by trying to collectively find an answer. I mean, in Central Station, many times we were physically so drawn that I thought that we weren't going to get to the end, and Fernanda Montenegro is forever young and so brilliant, and would come and say, what if we transform this into that? I mean, she had an understanding of the whole film way beyond her character that truly helped me. Gael and Gael Garcia Bernal in The Motorcycle Diaries, there were times I said, that's the last part of the, we were never going to be able to go further. He would get there and always bring ideas that would somehow nourish a rebirth of the film. I think that's very, very important for when you're shooting, to find ways to have that sense of rebirth. Jia Zhang-ke actually told me that he appears, he does characters in his films after the 30th day. He plays, you know, in the film, and say, why do you do that? And he says, because people are so bored after the 30th day that I want to bring something that can represent a new
but
story.
He never appears in front of the camera.
He does.
He does?
Yes. He plays a mafioso in A Touch of Sin, which is very funny.
I need to
in there. In that scene where San Ming, his cousin, plays the miner, he is the guy who's just near the attendant. It is him. He does his Hitchcockian appearance in most of his films. It's just that, and he takes pleasure in it. But he says that it's also to motivate. So the collectiveness of it is really something fundamental, and I find it more and more difficult to attain, because again there's so many distractions, you know, the telephones, and I remember when I started getting to sets, I would say, please don't forget to read your newspapers, you know, at lunch, or da-da-da-da. Now I said, please don't forget to put your cell phones on after we're finished to shoot. You know?
Right. Yeah.
As a way to say, you know, put them off. But that is not the easiest thing. Yeah, you really, and it's much, getting back to your question. If you have a project that is not shared by just a small group, but is shared by a larger group of actors and you know, people who take part of a film, I find it much easier. So the projects I'm developing now are for Gael, for Fernanda Montenegro, for actors that I truly love to work with, and I will probably be shooting them with, you know, the same crew that have been either shooting these films or this documentary. A new DP worked with me on this really loved his work, and it's quite the beauty of cinema, is to be able to extend things. You know?
We have time for one last question. Yes, Adam?
I was just wondering whether you know or sense that there might be any filmmakers that Jia Zhangke holds in the kind of high regard that you hold him in, that might be working today. I just wonder if you know.
If he has,
who does he look up
I
to?
think that Hu Xiaoxian would be probably his
Model?
his choice, you know, as interestingly, they are both in official competition in Cannes this year.
Oh God.
No, I don't. I think that's completely fine. If there's somebody who's not stressed by that, it's really.
How do you like
Jia
Hu
Zhangke.
Xiaoxian?
I'm sorry?
How do you like Hu Xiaoxian?
I like Hu Xiaoxian's films a lot. I don't know his work as thoroughly as I know Jia Zhangke's work, but I would say that there's always something that grabs me. I don't have that direct connection with. It's perhaps because the idea of characters somehow mirroring an identity in transformation, and all those forms of exile that abound in Jia Zhangke's films, either existential exile or economic, social exile. I can somehow relate to that very directly, and in the Hu Xiaoxian films, the equation is clearly a different one, and that I truly admire it and respect it. I loved 3 Times, for instance. I remember very well the beginning of Mambo. What's the name of that film?
Millennium Mambo.
Millennium Mambo. That was there are things that are moments that are truly striking and touch me deeply, but I don't find the exact same connection, but I do admire the filmmaker a lot.
I think that on that note, we should perhaps round up, and please a big round of applause to our dear guest. Thank you so much, Walter. Thank you.
I should invite you in all this crowd to all the film festivals we go to, because it's quite unique. Thank you so much for such an experience. It will stay with me for a long time. Thank you very much. Muito obrigado.
Obrigada.